They told you lighthouses were built to warn ships away from rocks, so why are hundreds of them sitting miles inland, far from any coastline? Why do they have no maintenance records before 1850? Why did every major government quietly decommission them within the same 50-year window? And why do the ones that remain look nothing like what a simple warning lamp should need to look like? Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The official story of lighthouses is one of the most unchallenged narratives in history. They were built, the story goes, by governments and maritime authorities to place a light at dangerous points along the coastline so that sailors could navigate safely in the dark. Fires, then oil lamps, then Fresnel lenses, then electricity. A long and noble tradition of public safety infrastructure. Nothing more complicated than that. But when you start looking at the actual physical evidence at the buildings themselves, at their locations, their construction, their internal architecture, and the timeline of when they were built and when they were shut down, the official story starts developing holes that are very hard to explain away. Start with the basic question of placement. If the purpose of a lighthouse is to warn ships away from a dangerous stretch of coast, then every lighthouse should be at the coast. That is the entire premise of the thing. A light that cannot be seen from open water is not a navigational warning. It is something else entirely. There are hundreds of documented structures around the world that are classified as historic lighthouses, or former lighthouses, or lighthouse-adjacent structures that are situated miles from any body of water navigable by ocean-going vessels. The Hesseter Head Lighthouse in Oregon sits high on a clifftop, which is coastal and understandable. But there are structures in the American Midwest, in inland European territories, in regions of South America and Central Asia that carry all the architectural hallmarks of what researchers now call the lighthouse form, and they have no relationship to maritime navigation whatsoever. Consider the distribution of so-called inland lighthouses across the American interior. Structures in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana that are recorded in local historical accounts as lighthouses, but sit nowhere near the Great Lakes or any river system large enough to require a navigational tower. When researchers raise this with local historical societies, the answer is almost always the same. They say the building was probably a grain silo, or a survey marker, or a folly built by an eccentric landowner. But the architecture does not match any of those explanations. The stonework, the internal stairwell geometry, the proportional relationships between the base diameter and the tower height. These match the lighthouse form precisely. And some of them predate the official history of American settlement in those regions entirely, sitting in areas that the official historical record says were wilderness or frontier territory at the time of their supposed construction. The response from mainstream historians is usually that these were river navigation aids, or that coastlines have shifted, or that they served as survey markers. These are not unreasonable explanations individually, but when you look at the sheer number of these anomalous structures, and when you start examining what they are actually built to do internally, the maritime explanation begins to look increasingly like a story retrofitted onto buildings that were constructed for a completely different purpose. Look at the construction itself. A lighthouse built purely to hold a lamp does not need to be a tower of solid granite or limestone going dozens of feet into the ground. It does not need internal stonework of the quality found in structures like the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, which has foundation engineering that engineers today describe as extraordinary for its supposed era of construction. It does not need the specific geometric proportions found consistently across lighthouse structures on multiple continents, proportions that researchers in the Tartarian hypothesis tradition have identified as matching the architectural language of what they argue was a prior global civilization. The Tartaria hypothesis, for those encountering it for the first time, argues that before the history we are taught, before the colonial era, before the medieval period is officially defined, there existed a far more advanced global civilization, sometimes called Tartaria or the Tartarian Empire, whose physical infrastructure was built into the landscape of every inhabited continent. The official historical record, according to this framework, was constructed after what researchers call the reset, a catastrophic event or deliberate erasure that destroyed or buried most of the evidence of this prior world and replaced it with the history we are taught in schools. Within this framework, lighthouses occupy a specific and fascinating position, because the argument is not that lighthouses were built by Tartaria to guide ships. The argument is that lighthouses were not built to guide ships at all. They were energy towers. They were antennas. They were nodes in a global network of free energy infrastructure that the prior civilization had built to transmit electrical power through the atmosphere, through the ground, and through the water to everyone who needed it, without wires, without fuel, without the system of controlled resource extraction that our present civilization runs on. The visual signature of this claim is not subtle once you start seeing it. Look at the Fresnel lens, the extraordinary glass apparatus installed in lighthouses across the world, beginning in the early 19th century, and officially described as a revolutionary improvement in lamp efficiency. The Fresnel lens is a masterpiece of optical engineering made of precisely cut glass prisms, arranged in concentric rings that capture and focus light from a central source into a powerful beam. But here is the thing. The energy output of a standard oil lamp, which is what these lenses were officially paired with before electrification, is simply not sufficient to produce the beams that lighthouse records describe. The documented visibility ranges of major lighthouses, some claiming to be visible at distances of 20, 25, even 30 miles at sea, cannot be produced by a whale oil lamp behind a glass lens, regardless of how perfect the lens geometry is. The physics do not support it. What the Fresnel lens geometry does support within the framework being advanced here is resonant amplification of a different kind of energy input entirely. The specific prism angles, the concentric ring structure, the focal point geometry. These are consistent with what researchers describe as characteristics of a device designed to interact with atmospheric or telluric electrical fields and concentrate or broadcast them, not simply to focus the light from a burning wick. And the towers themselves, the proportions of a lighthouse tower, the ratio of height to diameter, the taper profile from base to top, the materials used, the specific placement of windows and openings. All of these features appear consistently across lighthouse structures on multiple continents in ways that exceed what you would expect from independent development of a simple navigational tool. When the lighthouse builders of the United States Coast Survey were constructing towers along the American coastline in the mid-1800s, they were not just putting up warning lights. They were following a geometric and architectural template that had clear predecessors in structures across the Atlantic, structures that predate the official history of American lighthouse construction by centuries. The Pharos of Alexandria, the ancient wonder of the world, the lighthouse that supposedly guided ships into the harbor of Egypt for centuries before it was destroyed, fits this alternative framework in ways that the official story has never fully resolved. Ancient sources describe it producing a light visible from an extraordinary distance, far beyond what any fire of the era could produce. They describe it using mirrors and reflected sunlight during the day. But the building itself, by every account, was a tower of enormous complexity. Multiple stories, sophisticated internal architecture, a structure whose engineering far exceeded what was needed for a lamp on top of a tower. In the Tartarian framework, the Pharos was not a lighthouse in the navigational sense. It was the original energy tower, the prototype or the remnant of a prototype of the global transmission network. Its destruction was not an accident of time and earthquake. It was a step in the process of dismantling the old infrastructure to make room for the new order of controlled energy. Which brings us to what may be the most compelling piece of evidence in this entire argument: the decommissioning. Between roughly 1850 and 1950, virtually every major lighthouse in the developed world was either decommissioned, automated, transferred to museum status, or had its original function dramatically reduced. The official explanation is straightforward. Radio navigation made lighthouses largely obsolete. Modern GPS-era technology made them completely obsolete. Of course, you would shut them down, but look at the timeline more carefully. The mass decommissioning of lighthouses began before radio navigation was reliable enough to actually replace them. It began in some regions before radio navigation existed at all as a practical maritime tool. And the process was not simply one of allowing old infrastructure to fall into disuse. In many documented cases, specific internal components of lighthouses were removed, destroyed, or transferred to locations that have never been made publicly accessible. The lens rooms, the lamp rooms, the internal mechanical apparatus of major lighthouses were stripped out in ways that went far beyond what simple decommissioning would require. If these were just old buildings with oil lamps in them, why would anyone bother removing anything? You would simply turn off the light and walk away. The systematic removal of internal components from lighthouse structures around the world suggests that those components were of interest for reasons that have nothing to do with maritime navigation. Nikola Tesla understood this. His work on the wireless transmission of electrical energy, his Wardenclyffe Tower project, his theories about the Earth itself as a conductor of electrical power. All of this maps onto the Tartarian energy infrastructure framework with a precision that is difficult to dismiss. Tesla did not invent free energy transmission from nothing. The argument within this research tradition is that he was rediscovering it, working from fragments of prior knowledge, attempting to rebuild what had been destroyed or suppressed. He spoke repeatedly about tapping into the natural electrical energy already present in the Earth and the atmosphere. He spoke about it as though it was already there, already waiting, already proven, not as though he was proposing something new, but as though he was restoring something old. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was shut down, his funding was pulled, his papers were confiscated by the government after his death. The standard explanation is that it was commercially unviable because it could not be metered and sold. And that is exactly the point. The prior civilization's energy network, built into structures like lighthouses across every coastline on Earth, also could not be metered and sold. It was available to everyone who lived near it for free, simply by existing within range of the transmission. That is why it was shut down. Not because it stopped working, not because better technology replaced it, but because a system of free distributed atmospheric energy transmission is incompatible with a civilization built on the controlled sale of energy resources. The coal industry, the oil industry, the entire infrastructure of metered and purchased power, none of it can survive alongside a network of towers that give energy away for free to anyone living within their range. One of those systems had to go, and it was not the one that generated profit. The lighthouse was not a warning, it was a gift. And like most gifts from the world that came before ours, we were told it was something simpler, something less threatening to the order of things, until the day they came and quietly took it apart. They built them on every coast, on every continent, with engineering that a simple oil lamp never needed. Then, within 50 years, they quietly stripped them out and locked the doors. The physics never added up. The placements never made sense, and the decommissioning happened too fast and too thoroughly to be about obsolescence. The lighthouses were never just lights, and someone made sure you would never ask why. Hit subscribe and watch the next.